Good morning. Today's presentation is about climate change resilience, talking about adapting to weather and environmental threats. And there's a lot of stuff we want to talk about today, so let's get right to it. So I recognize that whenever you bring up the idea of global warming or climate change, there's always going to be some perspectives and debates on the issue. And the one thing I want to emphasize is that this is not a presentation that is going to be building toward debate or trying to address any of the disagreements about whether climate change is anthropogenic or if it's a cycle or whatever. The key thing is, and this is what I really want to focus on, is that we are definitely seeing changes in climate happening right now. Whether it's cyclical is irrelevant. The point is that there are things happening. We're seeing water shortages. We're seeing an increase in wildfires. So today's presentation is about focusing on the here and now, the things we need to know and the things we need to do to actually try to address some of the impacts that could be occurring with the conditions that we face today. So I brought up a couple of examples already about the seasonal decline of freshwater supply because of the decreased snowpack, as well as the increasing wildfires that are occurring. Just a quick side note, back in 2021, there was a week of some pretty heavy wildfire activity up in Lytton, British Columbia. So that's just across the border, maybe about an hour north. And I was actually driving back south through the region right after those wildfires. And what we didn't hear about, and this is pretty shocking, is that during that 1 week in southwestern British Columbia, those wildfires, they had 621 people die as a result of smoke complications, respiratory ailments, and that kind of thing, and directly because of the impacts of the wildfire alone. So that is actually something that comes out of climate change as well. What about the heat advisories? We know that we have now seen laws that require us not to shut off water during any heat advisory, and we've had a couple of them this summer as well. And then, of course, things like the increases in viruses and organic growth and contamination that we have to beef up our sanitation treatment processes when we find that in the water systems as well. So there are impacts. There are some very real ones, and these are some of the implications to our industry specifically. One of the important things that we do as a utility is we plan for contingencies and we plan for emerging threats and that kind of thing. And we're currently in the process of developing a risk and resiliency report that helps us address some of the anticipated changes or impacts that we're going to be seeing over the next decade. There's going to be some pretty new things and some pretty interesting things that we're going to have to make arrangements to address. And climate change, of course, is at the forefront of all of these. A lot of the impacts that I talked about and that I'm actually showing you in a little bit more detail here, they are part of the emerging threats that all public water and wastewater utilities are faced with. So we have to give that some thought. We have to put them into our emergency planning, and we have to really prepare, even as individuals, which I'll get to in a second, on how to address these changes in our global landscape and our climate. So going into a little bit more detail from our previous slide, there's a bunch of real observable evidence here indicating that global warming is in fact having an impact on our region. And I'm not going to go through each one of these, but I am going to pick out a couple of them just to kind of emphasize and talk about specifics. So let's take a look at the warmer air temperatures. Now, of course, when it gets warmer in the summer, there's going to be people who will use more fresh water. And so we're going to see people using it in the yard, perhaps people refreshing the water in their pools, or just getting out and putting on sprinklers and making sure that their lawns are irrigated properly too. So there's going to be an increase in usage, and that's an impact on us as well. So we have to take that into consideration. And then moving down further on that list, there is one you'll see, that more acidic marine waters. Well, what does that mean? How does that really impact us? Well, let's think about it for a second. If the Puget Sound, if we're talking about Port Susan and Port Gardner and so, becomes more acidic because of climate change and increasing temperatures, the water that we spill back into the Puget Sound, so we're talking about the outflow from our treatment plant, we're going to have to be aware that the alkalinity or anything that is in the composition of that water, when it hits a more acidic base, it could potentially have some strong ecosystem impacts too. So it might be increased bacterial growth, more algae growth, maybe there's going to be more cleaning necessary of our pipes, that kind of thing. But there will be a change when one type of water goes into a larger water source. So all these little things are things we need to plan for and prepare contingencies for. So there definitely is some real hard evidence, real-time evidence of change happening here. And these are the things, again, that we need to take into consideration. It may be important for us to kind of look at what this means in the long term. What they're projecting, based on current trends, is by the 2040s, we're going to see a 40% diminishment in snowpack in this region, and that'll go up to 59% by the 2080s. Now, of course, many of us won't be around in that term, but our kids will be. And so looking at the water shortages in the state is pretty important. I mean, they're talking about places like the Yakima Basin, and then even worse, Walla Walla and further east in the state, that there might be a possibility that they won't be able to supply water to all their users. And of course, it's going to impact salmon habitat because utilities are going to need to make a decision on whether to put water releases out there for the benefit of salmon habitat or to provide for people to drink. I mean, it's sort of a double-edged sword. So there are impacts. There are long-term impacts, and if we can conduct some planning, we might be able to mitigate some of these impacts in the future, but it's important for us to act now, and the first step is recognizing that planning is necessary. One thing that emergency managers routinely do is what's called a threat and hazard identification and risk assessment. So that's a term known as THIRA. And essentially, it's, like I said before, a form of planning, but we identify the threats. And in this case, we are looking at the threats presented by climate change. And then we identify the hazards. We identify what strategies we can take to address those hazards. And the important thing is we continue to learn. We recognize that learning is a continuing process. And it's not just something that we as a utility need to do, but ultimately I'll talk a little bit more about how we can do some planning for ourselves and our own families as well. But back to the utility, we have to understand our utility, our operations, the needs required by people in the community and those who depend on us. And then we have to build capacity, whether that is increasing staff, increasing the ability to react to risk or proactively respond to prevent anything that potentially could be dramatic happening here. All of these are parts of developing a good risk strategy, and the first and most important part of that is understanding the threats, and that's what we're trying to do today when we talk about looking at the potential impact of climate change. Part of the planning could involve us conducting a number of different strategies, and some of them might be to explore alternative water sources. Now, we've got reservoirs that make it a bit of a challenge to find alternative reservoirs or different lakes where we can get fresh water, but we can certainly look at bringing in water from different areas using bulk haulers, doing mutual aid agreements with different partners and neighbors and so forth, and different water agencies, perhaps those south of us and so forth. And that includes things like bringing in different chemicals in the event that we run out of chlorine or there's a shortage, making sure that there's an adequate alternative supply chain available. These are all part of the strategies we can look at too. And then, as I've mentioned a couple of times now, we have to look at what we are doing individually because our workforce is probably the biggest resource that we have. So personal preparedness is a big part of that equation. There are some steps you can take to make sure that you and your family are resilient as well. One of those, and basically, is to make sure that you have an adequate water supply. Water is critical, as we know in our industry, that most people can only survive for 2 days without water. Making sure that you have bottled water, perhaps if you're not on a well, if you've got some other sources, stored water, even a rain barrel that you can filter, is one way of making sure that in an emergency you do have access to fresh water at home. Secondly is to retrofit your home. If you're in an area where there's a lot of smoke or there's a lot of particulate, even allergens and that kind of thing, if you retrofit your home to reduce the entry of any kind of atmospheric particulates, that can help you quite a bit too. So that includes putting things like filters in, air filters. You can also plant native trees. The more trees that we plant, that's a natural way for CO2 sequestration. So that's also filtering light and heat away from your home. That's a pretty easy one. There's never any harm in planting trees. But these individual things are just a few of the steps you can take to ensure personal resilience. And as you know, that once you're sure that everything at home is okay, that makes it a lot easier. You've got a lot more peace of mind to come in and to ensure that we continue to deliver the services that those that depend on us as a utility need during any kind of an event. And I think we need to be a little bit more aware of that in the future. Every step you can take to make yourself more resilient is ultimately going to impact your family in a good way and also allow you to help others. Many of you have heard me use the term of us all being critical first responders. Well, we are first responders. And one of the main reasons, sort of to summarize this presentation, is that we need to think of ourselves as a critical piece of the infrastructure in providing public services and helping people overcome issues when things become tougher and when we're seeing some of these challenges created by warming weather and so forth. So this is part of the reason why I really want to emphasize the importance of our role as a utility to make sure that the service is uninterrupted, making sure that the water can get to fire stations, to hospitals, and all those places that depend on us, and also the individuals in the community, the differentially abled people and folks that are just very, very dependent on a strong and consistent force of flowing water and making sure that hygiene and sewer services continue unabated. So this is critical. Give it some thought. Do what you can do to mitigate any of the problems related with the changing climate. And let's do our best to provide those services uninterrupted to our customers. So this summarizes our emergency management in brief for September, National Preparation Month. And if you have any questions, go ahead and reach out to me by email or drop by the office. And if you have any other concerns or things you'd like to discuss or ideas you might have, please let me know. And if it's something that everybody else should know, we'll definitely find a way to share it to everybody at Alderwood. Thanks for your attention.